Every person's story has something to teach us. How others view life, how obstacles are overcome, how joy is felt, how fears are faced, how love is expressed. The Matters of Faith podcast explores individual stories of people's lives and how faith plays a part. It may not be your story, but it may help shape yours. And now, Matters of Faith with your host, Jay Wilburn.
You have found the Matters of Faith podcast on Project Entertainment Network with your host, Jay Wilburn. This is episode 81. Our guest today is Kevin Lucia. He is an author, but is also very open about his faith, and we talk in detail about his writing and how faith has played out in his life at different times. Coming soon from Kevin Lucia from Crystal Lake, you can find a short story collection, Things You Need, which is scheduled to come out September 28th, so be on the lookout for that. He also has a new novella coming from Cemetery Dance in the near future called Mystery Road. You can check out Kevin Lucia now on Facebook at Kevin B. Lucia, Lucia, and of course you can check him out at his website, kevinlucia.com, Lucia spelled Lucia. Before we get into that episode, a great interview that we did at Scares That Care, the convention that was earlier in August. He was kind enough to sit down with me on a Sunday morning of the convention, which is not usually when most people are up, but we got a good interview in. I think you're going to enjoy it. But before we get to that, Project Entertainment Network wants to tell you about some advertising opportunities that they have available. Advertise on Project Entertainment Network and you'll reach intelligent, highly engaged listeners and enjoy high name and product recall. With over 24 diverse podcasts, our aim at Project Entertainment Network is to offer great content and be the one stop for excellent episodes and shows and the perfect place for you to promote your business. Podcasts are one of the best values in advertising because unlike other mediums, they offer a stunning 80% product and brand name recall, and they reach exclusive audiences that don't consume a lot of advertising, a great way to reach millennials and cord cutters, people who don't have cable and that sort of thing. And an ad on one of our podcasts is evergreen. Your ad will be heard for weeks, months, and years to come as new listeners find episodes. I know for a fact people who pick up on a particular podcast will often start with episode 1 and work their way forward. So again, no matter when your ad shows up on a show, very likely more listeners are going to hear it again and again long after the ad is recorded and the first aired. We offer several options for each of our podcasts, all tailored to get you the most customers to hear about your product. We have a 15-second pre-roll sponsorship for $35. You provide sponsorship type copy to run just before our show begins. You get 15 for $60. You can get 15 pre-roll and 15 post-roll sponsorship. You provide sponsorship type copy, and it bookends our show top and bottom. And then there's a premier content package. I believe this is also for $60. You get 30 to 60 second midpoint ad, 15 post-roll plus Twitter blast to over 125,000 followers. I believe that's all for $60. The best value and the most fun. Our panelists riff on your podcast, on your product during the midpoint of our show. Mention it again at the end and you'll get a Twitter blast from the PIN accounts to over 125,000 followers. There are premium bundles where you can get multiple ads, 2 ads for $100, 5 ads for $225, 10 ads for $400. Includes a free ad on the PIN website. Please note the Horror Show with Brian Keene podcast is not part of this deal or these prices. An ad on the Horror Show with Brian Keene is $100. All right. If you're interested, you can contact Armand Rosamilia at armandrosamilia@gmail.com. That's ARMANDROSAMILIA@gmail.com. You can contact him for extra details. You can also PayPal the payments directly to him and then email the copy to him. If you want more details, you can email him. PIN, Project Entertainment Network, looks forward to working with you and helping you grow your business. Check out their social media for more information about each podcast too. You can go to projectentertainmentnetwork.com, Project Entertainment Network on Facebook, Project ENTNET on Twitter, same Project Net, Project EntNet, ProjectEntNet on Instagram, and then we have a YouTube channel as well that you can check out. So again, all those advertising options are available, and you can go also to the website and click on the advertising icon at projectentertainmentnetwork.com and get details there and ways that you can contact to get more information about the type of ads that you can run. We would definitely look forward to promoting you and your passions and your business here on the Matters of Faith podcast, but then also any of the podcasts on Project Entertainment Network, and you can get deals for multiple podcasts as well if you want to get multiple ads. Again, thank you for considering advertising. We look forward to working with you, and now we'll get into the rest of the episode. This is the Matters of Faith podcast on Project Entertainment Network with your host, Jay Wilburn. My guest today is Kevin Lucia. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and we're recording live from Scares That Care at 11 a.m. on a Sunday, which, for those that may not be convention goers, that is a few hours after most people have gone to bed.
Or some have not gone to bed yet.
Right. And the rest have gone to bed and have gotten up and are going home. Yeah. So we're going to be... I really appreciate Kevin actually getting up to come. What time did you actually go to bed last night?
I was in bed by 3.
Okay.
I was in bed
so
by 3.
That's almost a responsible
time. In bed by 3 and up by 8 o'clock. So I really only need about 5 hours.
You were already editing a story when you got up this morning.
Well, I have children, and I love them dearly, but when I go to conventions, I consider them to be working vacations because I'm like, guess what I don't have this morning? I'm not, my son's not getting up at 6 o'clock and I'm not making breakfast for everyone, so it's an opportunity to get some editing done. So I usually try to get to bed at, like I said, for convention time, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, so a reasonable hour.
Yes, absolutely.
So then, that way I can get up and get some writing done before everything starts.
How's your convention going? Are you moving some books?
I'm moving some books. But you know what? It's at this stage in the game, you start going to conventions. I don't know if this is similar for other writers. You start going to conventions, and at first you're a nobody, and you're just kind of like agog at all the people you're seeing, and people like Brian Keene and Chris Gold and things like that.
Yeah.
Then when you get a few things published, you're kind of like, you get caught up in the selling your books and things like that. But the stage I'm in at now is like, I go to a convention, and this is my opportunity to be in my tribe. You know what I mean? So, I've sold enough books for this not to be a loss, but that's almost incidental. You know what I mean? I get to be with my people and my friends and my other fellow weirdos, and that becomes more important, really, than the selling of the book. So, from that standpoint, it's been wonderful. So.
Yeah. I'm still at the stage where, like, Brian Keene knows who I am, and we interact and have done things together and stuff, but I still kind of get freaked out when he's in the room. Like, I just feel like, oh, man, he's here and he knows my name.
Yep.
So, moving from the convention into kind of your story, like how did your journey of faith begin for you?
Well, I was raised, in a Christian home. Okay, but what I've always liked to say, and I know when you start talking about faith and Christianity and things like that, there's so many different denominations to begin with, which I was unaware of until I actually went to 2.5 years of Bible college, and it was a non-denominational Bible college, so that was quite an eye-opener for me. You know? But I always like to tell people that my dad was what I like to call a first-generation Christian, which means he became a Christian late in life, and for him, I've always looked up to him as being a man of faith, but this is going to sound terrible. I don't want to say he was a man of faith, but he's like also a normal person. But I have a lot of friends who would go through like extreme conversion experiences and then be like, I threw out 500 of my secular evil CBs, and I'd be like, you should have let me go through them first, And so my dad came to faith because he always used to joke with me that he got to a point in his mid-20s where he was like, well, there's got to be more to life than drinking fast cars and fast women. And so it was, for him, it was a genuine. So when he came to faith, it was not about this, my life before was worthless and now, no, his life gained more purpose and his, and he had filled something inside of him, but he was still, it didn't really change him fundamentally as his character, as a person. So being one of the shocking things, or not shocking things, but when I went to Bible college, kids were all be like, hey, I'm going to go see a movie. They're like, what's it rated? And they'd be like, it's PG-13. No. I'm like, well, you realize you're 22, right? You can go see the PG-13 movie, and my dad was just very common sense about some of those things. So it was, he was a Christian, but he never restricted, I don't think he restricted any of my reading. I think the only restrictions he ever gave me is once I bought a Star Trek novel at a garage sale, and my dad's advice was, well, just, that Jim Kirk. He's a little, got to be careful of that Jim Kirk. And I think I did buy a copy of Jaws, and he sort of wanted to read it first, and there didn't end up being a sex scene early, but he put it on his bookshelf, so he didn't really ever restrict me. So, and that really shaped me a lot, especially today, just that, again, I'm searching for the right words, but when you become a Christian or any faith in that matter, there's a level of indoctrination. You run the risk of indoctrination,
right,
where you become a member of this faith, and if you get so indoctrinated into this culture and its rules and this, we must reject the world and things like that, then you just kind of lose, that old phrase, he's too heavenly good, he's too heavenly to be any earthly good.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that's really been a guiding light for me, as an adult.
Now, when you say Bible college, are you talking like a Christian-based school where you could study anything, or was it like actual?
It was a legit Bible college, religious study. I kind of had a similar awakening that my dad had, even though I was in a Christian home. I went to Binghamton University my freshman year, and then found that you can't spend all your time in the lounge watching TV. So after I left there, I went to Broome Community College for 2 years, and I played basketball there. But at the end of my time there, I had gotten caught up a little bit in the club culture and going out and drinking and things like that, and I knew that I needed, a little bit of direction in my life. So the only other, also on a side note, we have 3 colleges in our city, and I've gone to all 3. So I usually like to tell people if they opened a 4th college, I would have to attend one semester there just on principle alone to make sure I went to all of them. But I attended Davis. It's currently called Davis College. When I attended, it was actually called Practical Bible College, and it was basically one step short of a seminary.
Right.
I majored in counseling, so in the counseling degree, if I went far enough, I could get my certification to be a guidance counselor in high schools.
Okay.
So I majored in counseling. I didn't major in ministry and things like that, but it was largely a ministry school. And it was a different culture that I had stepped into, that's for sure.
Okay, what led you to want to go into counseling? Like, why was that the path for you?
I think for me, ironically enough, and I didn't end up actually staying in counseling, because my first love has always been English and reading and writing. And at the time, when my time at Bible college ended, and I knew it was time for me to move on, I went back to my first love and graduated from BU with my English degree. But at the time, I almost think like I was in counseling more for self-therapy than anything else. Really seriously, because I had never really thought about, and one of the things I can say about the counseling program at Davis was that it was considered to be biblical counseling, but all my professors, when we talked about secular methods of counseling, they would say, like, look, all of these things can give us a wealth of information about how people think and how people act. Like, for example, I can't remember the guy who came up with it, but there's a behavior model where you're either a thinker, feeler, actor, or
right,
actor, feeler, thinker, or that sort of thing. And I'm not going to say that I made lots of bad choices, but I made lots of. I had a brief window there where the choices were not good. And one of the things I realized, I'm wearing one of our classes, and I realized that I was a feeler, actor, thinker. So I feel something, I act, and I go, ooh, what did I just do? So it was little things like that. I'm not going to tell you that I came out of that experience like fully matured, but actually thinking about why we make the decisions we do, why we act the way we do, how that can impact us, our character, and things like that. Like I said, I very honestly think I was in the counseling program for self-therapy more than actually wanting to practice counseling later. So
you teach now, right?
I do. I teach high school English.
All right. And how has that wealth of experience kind of helped with that process of being the kind of teacher you want to be? A little
bit. I think also, too, all the jobs that I held through college it always involved teens or elementary education or working with special needs and things like that. So I identified right away that being around kids, and I hope this doesn't make me sound like a vampire, but being around kids rejuvenates you. I mean, it's like, it keeps you on your toes, and you can't like settle into this sedentary, routine way of life, because, teens are crazy. That's the way they're supposed to be, So that, I think, played more into my, decision to become a teacher. That and like loving English and writing and things like that. So
when did writing start for you?
Well, writing, I've got your really close classic like Hallmark story. I mean, I was
awesome.
I was in eighth grade. I was a voracious reader first. That's what it was. I just love to read. And someone came up with the idea. I think it was maybe our computer teacher or something like that. They wanted to do a school newspaper.
Okay.
And school newspapers don't usually have fiction stories in them, but when you're doing a publication like that for school, you're just like, well, give us something that we can print out and hand out, And I had, for some reason, thought, I'll write stories. Now, that newspaper never came to fruition, but the idea of tinkering and writing things kind of just like lodged itself there. And I never really completed anything through high school. Or at least junior high. But I started like tinkering and writing, and then suddenly my senior year, I just wrote, I'm going to do quotation marks, a novel, like in a spiral notebook, and I just wrote the whole thing, and it was the first time that I had this obsessive, I've got to write this, and I would be like late at night, I'd be like in my bedroom under the covers with a flashlight writing, and I always like a joke that most boys my age probably were with a flashlight and some other kind of reading material under their bed covers. Here and I am like writing, and I just couldn't stop writing. I just had to write this thing out, and then I gave it to my English teacher, my senior English teacher, and it was like one of those things where because I also was kind of the stereotypical, high school. I'm not going to say jock, because jock is a completely different. But I was an athlete. I played three sports. That's how everybody knew me. And I did well enough at those sports that they were like, oh, okay. So the concept that this guy actually writes and he reads, I didn't I wasn't ashamed of that. But like when we walked out of my English class one day, I was kind of like walked up to the desk like, Miss Besser, can you look at this? I wrote this, and I just ran out the door, and just dropped it on her desk, and and she did some, and it's funny because her critiques, as a writer, there's a lot of things you can improve with, but it really shows how important it is to have beta readers, because sometimes writers just have tics that you're never going to get rid of. And her comments about how exposition heavy my writing was and you need more dialogue is still true today.
You're still hearing it.
It is. My beta readers still tell me this paragraph's way too long. But she wrote, I'll never forget what she wrote. She said, you need to get published, and you need to do this, and that's, once that happened, it was like, that was all she wrote. I was gonna write, and I wanted to get published.
Is any iteration of that novel in existence now?
No, that was a young adult sports novel about a senior in high school who leads his team to the state championship, all while winning back his ex-girlfriend, and has no bearing on my life at that time at all. It was not fantasy fiction about my life. No, but totally imagined about somebody else.
That's funny. What was your first published piece?
My first published piece, believe it or not, was my junior year in college. There was a little magazine that operated out of California called Millennium Science Fiction and Fantasy Magazine. And initially I thought I was going to be a sci-fi writer. I loved to read sci-fi. I got into Isaac Asimov really heavy in high school in the Foundation series. So I wrote this little time travel, slipstream, I don't know, in one of my English folklore classes, we covered something to do with the Native Americans and their beliefs in the passing of time. So I wrote some little, and I mailed it off and got paid $15. And I was like, ooh, this is gas for the week in Taco Bell. Woohoo! Sadly, I did not write, and again, this is the one thing I always tell all my kids, and I teach creative writing at my high school, and I kind of have a personal reason for doing that, because I feel like, I believe that everything happens, our lives, not that we're fated, but obviously with my faith, I believe that things work out the way they're meant to work out.
Right.
But if there was one thing I could change by the way things were done, that I would have followed up that short story, and I would have been like, I just got paid for a short story. I should write more short stories. But what I did was like, well, that was nice, but I'm just going to keep working on this novel that they're going to make a movie of someday, so I can sit by a lake and sip my champagne and write, when I feel like it. So I proceeded just to kind of plug along on novels, and I did not publish anything again until I was probably, I can't remember the date now exactly, it was 2007. So probably not until I was 30 34, 35.
Okay.
I just kind of never sent anything out ever again after that. And the sad thing is that magazine, I have since, in my many moves, I have since lost a copy, and that, of course, was saved on those square rectangular discs, and I don't even know what happened to that. So there's no copy of that story in existence anymore. So that was my first published piece, though.
How often do you engage short fiction now?
I go in spurts, For a while there, I was laboring along on trying to write a novel, but I realized that I had one crucial problem with writing a novel. I didn't know how to end it. So, I would just keep writing and writing and writing and writing, and then I'd get frustrated and then go back and re-edit the first half of that novel, and I would just do that over and over again until, and again, very cliche, I'm sure everyone has the same story, but then I read, because everyone kept recommending it, I read On Writing by Stephen King. Mm-hmm. And one of the things he talked about is he gave a really nice illustration in there, and if anyone would read that today, I don't know if that illustration is quite, because things have changed so much in publishing, but he gave an illustration of an imaginary writer, and he talked about his fledgling career. And when King talked about how this imaginary writer did not set out and start trying to write a novel, he wrote articles for different venues, and he wrote short stories, that's when it kind of clicked in my head. I'm trying to write a 100K novel, and I don't know how to end it. So I started writing nonfiction, and I started writing short stories. The problem that I found is, even when I eventually learned how to end these short stories, they were okay. I published a few in some semi-pro venues. Mm-hmm. But it kind of clicked to me, and I don't know where I heard this. I don't know if I heard it, someone overheard it. Part of me wants to say that I read it on one of Nick Mamatas's blogs, but I realized that I was trying to write short stories, and I wasn't reading any short stories. I was just reading novels. I wasn't reading any short stories. So then I just went on a glut of reading as many short stories as I possibly could. I had this one summer where I spent the whole summer reading. I actually read in one summer 198 of Ray Bradbury's short stories. Wow. And then I read, I'm a teacher. The caveat to that is I'm a teacher and I have my summers off, so I just consider that professional development. But I read, at that point I had discovered the Shadows anthology series by Charles Grant and Whispers and Carl Edward Wagner's run at Best of Horror and Borderlands. So I just read those short stories all summer, and then I finally started writing some short stories and selling them at the professional level. And for me, it goes in spurts. I will say this: I would love to be that type of person that can, the Bradbury method, where you write one short story a week. Yeah. And I actually did spend one summer where I resolved to write one short story a week. But what I found is that if I don't have a solicitation, those short stories end up turning into novellas very quickly. So right now, I tend to only write a short story if an editor has asked me for a short story. And it's not because I'm I'll only write one if you ask me. For me, the asking really gives me structure. Right. If the first request that I got was for Shadows Over Main Street, and the request was for Lovecraftian fiction in a small town setting. Right. And I actually, for that one, I actually had a story already that had been kind of, and here's also a caveat for any writers out there: when you get rejected, suck it up and send it back out again. Because here's what happens a lot. I had been solicited a story for an anthology that was Lovecraftian in nature, and they were only really paying about $25, but I was like, okay, cool. And I wrote the story, and then somewhere in the course of that anthology's development, this really short invite list got really huge, and I suddenly found my story getting rejected. Yeah. And I was like, what? Okay, all right. But then I turned right around, and I got invited to an anthology with a pro pay. Right. So this story that got rejected from a $25 token anthology then suddenly sold at a pro pay level. Yeah. So you don't know what's going to happen with those stories. Just keep writing. But then I got invited to an anthology called Gutted. Beautiful horror stories. And again, the idea was we're looking for stories with an emotional core. So when I get invitations, it's not that I'm I'll only write when someone asks me. For short stories especially, I wish I was that person that could just sit and just had such a fertile imagination. They could just write a dozen short stories in 1 year. But I really need to have that invitation to an anthology where there's like, okay, there's this or that, and that frees me up to be like, okay, this is structure for me. So I really haven't written that many short stories. So.
What was your first published novel?
I haven't had a published novel yet, actually.
Okay.
My first published book was, I don't know if anyone remembers Shroud Publishing. They were early on the scene. They were back in like 2007, run by Tim Deal. And I sold a short story to their anthology, Abominations. And that got me in the fold with him. And Tim Deal wanted to do a novella series, craft around this character. His name was Hiram Grange. And he wanted to craft around like a character who was like this booze-swilling, opium-smoking, occult monster fighter. You know? So I just imagine like Sherlock Holmes with lots of guns and way worse habits. So he recruited 5 different writers to write the novellas. And that was my first standalone, was that. And again, for me, that was a really great opportunity because at that time, the idea of writing a novel or even a novella length work and finishing it was kind of daunting. But because I was writing for a publisher, for a character, he didn't tell me anything about what my plot had to be, but I knew where the book before me was going to end, and I knew where the book after me was going to take off.
Right.
And they developed a Hiram Grange Bible, so we knew about the character and things like that. It was almost like, it's not quite the same as like writing a media tie-in or something like that, but it was the kind of like for example, like Tim Wagner writes a lot of the supernatural novels. I mean, he all he's got to do is come up with a story, and I'm not, if Tim Wagner ends up hearing this, I'm not slamming that because that's hard work.
Yeah.
But he's got a lot of wealth of stuff to draw on when it comes to Sam and Dean and the supernatural mythos.
Right.
So it was a little bit like that. So that was my first book, and that was published in May 2010. And since then, it's just been short story collections and novella collections and novellas. So
Okay.
yeah.
When did you make the transition from sci-fi to, I guess, being a horror writer?
Well, when I was in college again, I sat down and I ended up writing a 170K novel that was only part 1 of an epic space opera trilogy. And at that point, Tor and Rock were still accepting unsolicited manuscript submissions. So I actually sent them out to them both and got rejection letters, as I should. I think what ended up occurring to me is, first of all, as a reader, I was starting to really wear out on the sci-fi genre. Mm-hmm. I don't know why, because I don't want to say it's about the sci-fi genre itself, because there are lots of, lifelong. But for whatever reason, the sci-fi genre was no longer addressing the questions I had about my own life. Mm-hmm. I went through a period there in my life where I had gotten engaged. I was engaged to a girl for 2 years, and then 4 months before the wedding, I broke it off because I knew it wasn't going to last, and and I was just in this not in a good place. And suddenly, for me, science fiction wasn't doing it for me. It wasn't, and I guess that's an interesting, probably that's like a segue, a sidebar that really says a lot about why I write and why I read the stuff I do, because I have questions about our life and our existence and how we grapple with things. And that's not to say that good sci-fi can't address that, but a lot of the sci-fi that I was coming across was like either military sci-fi or space opera, or I'm writing, so it wasn't really doing it for me. And like I said, I was looking for that. Like I was looking for writing to read, and I was looking for my own writing. Well, I need to tackle some big questions. Like, if anyone's not read, and you should, To Each Their Darkness by Gary Braunbeck. It's his writing memoir. Mm-hmm. And also, if you're not reading Gary Braunbeck, then you should. But he, somewhere there in To Each Their Darkness, he says, I want to know why. Why do people suffer? Why do people give up and maybe end their lives? Why do children die? Why are people, and mm-hmm. those questions, I wasn't maybe asking those big questions, but I was asking questions like, how could I be with someone for 2 years and then suddenly it becomes apparent at the end that we're not compatible? Right. Why am I struggling with my matters of faith at that time, which I was kind of a crisis in faith. So science fiction wasn't doing it for me. And then I picked up a little novel by some guy called Stephen King called Desperation.
Right.
And again, as a kid in the 80s, I obviously, that was the time of Freddie and Jason Voorhees and Mike Myers and things like that. And I would always see the previews for their trailers for the movies on TV, and I would just think to myself, I'm not interested in that, So that was what I would hear Stephen King's name. That's horror, Freddy Krueger's horror. I'm not interested in reading that. So I picked up the Stephen King book, and I'm like, all right. At the time, I was writing some book reviews at like a local newspaper. Well, I say newspaper as the kind of paper you get in your mailbox and you use for the kitty litter box. But anyway, so I said, okay, well, I'll review this book that's by Stephen King. It's horror. And then suddenly I'm in the middle of this novel that's asking all these gut-wrenching questions about God and faith and good and evil. And I was just like, and then I followed that up with The Stand, and I'm like just transformed, and I'm like, this is the stuff that I want to write. This is the stuff that's, at the very least, even if I wasn't thinking about those big questions yet, this, for lack of a better term, darkness or these conflicts I was having, this is filling a hole that science fiction is not. And that's when I transferred over and I started to try to write that stuff.
Okay, now the school you teach at, is it public school or private?
Catholic school.
Okay.
It's Catholic school.
Do you ever find yourself having to explain your writing habits?
It's funny because in the course of my writing career, I've met several horror writers that are teachers also, like Jonathan Jans, and I think at one point, and I'm going to say his name wrong, Adam Cesare, and they've wisely chosen pseudonyms. This apparently never occurred to me that I should write as. But on one hand, I'm very blessed that my administrators at my school take the viewpoint of we have a professionally published writer who's on staff here.
Right.
That's also too. It probably helps that the type of stuff I write is for the most part not going to. I mean, I when I discovered, there was an early period there where I was writing stuff, and I'm like, I want to be a horror writer. So, that's blood, guts, zombies.
Right.
When I discovered the work of several writers in particular, Charles Grant, and T.M. Wright, Ramsey Campbell, and then on a more contemporary level, Mary San Giovanni and Norman Prentice. And I'm like, this quiet, atmospheric horror, this is the stuff for me. Right. So it probably also helps that the stuff that I write is, for the most part, if there's any violence and bloodshed, it's very much thematic and plot-oriented. It does not generally, I'll be happy to traffic in innuendo, but you're not going to see it, for the most part, anything sexually graphic from me, at least and not in anything that's going to be widely disseminated. I will say that when I put my first collections, Things Slip Through together, there was one story that was a little sexually graphic for me that I ended up choosing not to include in that collection.
Oh, really?
Because you sell a short story to like a small press semi-pro anthology out of Minnesota, it's unlikely that your average 10th grade student is going to come across that anthology.
Right.
But now if you're putting a collection together, and even so, Crystal Lake is not a Big Five publisher, now you're putting a collection together, you're going to end up having a signing at your local Barnes & Noble.
Right.
Your students are going to end up finding out about that. So you're going to want to be a little careful about, and as it turns out, it's a good thing I did that, because as soon as my students found out I had a book out, like 25 of them bought a copy. So I was glad I pulled that story, because that was, so there are little decisions I'll make along those lines. But for the most part, they've never had any issue with the stuff that I write.
And if you've never had any trouble reconciling it yourself?
Oh, no.
When you're writing?
I mean, first of all, as an English teacher, half the stuff, if you teach Shakespeare, come on.
Right.
Shakespeare's full of sex, death, treachery, revenge.
Right,
The stuff that I'm teaching the kids, a lot of the times, I don't teach anything terribly inappropriate, but the literature that they read, and the way I teach them, we're talking about everything on the page has a reason. Everything on the page, has substance and things like that. I've never had. Also, too, at the end of the day, I wouldn't say that I write Christian fiction. I don't. That was a brief phase that I went into, and maybe we can get into the reasons why I chose not to do that. There are many reasons why I chose not to do that. But at the end of the day, I'm fairly confident that what I write, even if there's not even this single mention of Christianity throughout the story, my values are going to permeate that entire story. You know, I've been very blessed. On occasion, I'll have a stranger who will just randomly Facebook me and say, "Well, I read your most recent book, and there's nothing in there, but I have to ask, are you a Christian?"
Right.
I said, because I just feel it coming off the story in waves. So I know that's going to end up being in there. And again, if you were to look in the Bible, I mean, guy gets a stake through the head. I mean, King David's sons came to really bad endings after doing terrible things. So,
like all the stories that are skipped in the Sunday school lessons.
Right. No one read the Song of Solomon in Sunday school. You know, we did not get that information. So I definitely have that. I'm okay with that. So
now you've brought some horror writers' work into your classes, right?
Absolutely.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, every October. I think also to preface this, I think every English teacher has their own stuff. They have their own like your favorites and your own bent. But as an English teacher, especially high school, the biggest thing at the end of the day is getting kids to read stuff that they're going to engage with, that they may be like, oh, this is not the same old thing, you know? Right. And also, too, when you boil everything down to it, if you strip away all my highfalutin reasons for writing what I do, when you strip away all these wonderful little like quotables about the importance of literacy and education, reading is just freaking fun. Right. And it should be fun, you know, right. And I think that largely in high school education, I found a very dismaying thing in my 15 years of teaching. I don't know what it's like at other places in other states, but a lot of the young teachers I run into, and even some of the older teachers, English teachers, are not actually readers themselves.
Oh, wow.
It's really sad. Like, I feel like that English in some cases, and again, I can't speak for other places in schools, but in my experience, English becomes that job for the person who wants to teach her and wants to teach her hours. Yeah. But maybe they're not a math or science person and they're not history. Well, they're like, well, I'll become an English teacher and I'll teach that same 2 or 3 books that all English teachers teach, like Animal Farm or The Great Gatsby or Of Mice and Men, and I'll just follow the lesson plan, and that's what I'll assign to my kids. You know, where at the end of the day, like I joked about how, you know, as a teacher, my summer of professional development is just literally reading. But it literally is professional development because I'm always on the hunt when I'm reading over the summer. That was an amazing story. And I don't know if I should say this because this is probably copyright issues when you're photocopying and you're not supposed to, but I wish all teachers break anyway, but I'm always like finding stories and being like, oh, I'm going to use that for my class next year. And I found that, like I said, I mean, I'm not going to like sell out on literary classics and things like that. I like to give the kids all of them. Like, here's literary classics, here's something that's a little more engaging. But I decided that I said October should be, okay, it's October. We're going to study horror fiction this month, you know, and a lot of kids, because I find that a lot of the kids have the same notion that horror fiction has to have blood, guts, you know, like we read, my sophomores every year read The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, and they always ask me when I'm handing this book out, is this book scary? And I'm like, well, is the book going to make you jump and scream, and is it going to gross you out and other clanking monsters? No. At the end of the novel, are you going to be looking at Eleanor Vance's life and thinking, that's awful? Then yes. Yeah. And that's what horror fiction, you know, at its highest form, it does do. You know, so yeah. So my sophomores always read The Haunting of Hill House. My freshmen, because they're still freshmen, and freshmen are a weird animal because they're not 8th graders anymore, but they're not sophomores either. And there's like this, like, you've got a mix of really mature students and kids that think they're still 8th graders and they like fart jokes. So so we ended up reading Something Wicked This Way Comes freshman year. So it's not really, it's got a little touch of that darkness. And last year, my juniors, now I have regular juniors. Like there's at my school, there's 11 AP, and there's 11 regions because we have the regions in New York State. The 11 regions kids typically tend to be the kids who are like, whatever, Even they're not unintelligent. Reading's dumb. Reading's boring. So this past year I read Carrie.
Okay.
And that grabbed their attention.
Wow.
They're like, this is actually good. I'm like, yes, it is. And then my 12 AP students, we read Salem's Lot. You know, and especially for even the 12 AP students. Now, like as an AP teacher, if there are any AP teachers that are listening, obviously that's an advanced placement course, and we need to read things throughout the year that's going to, prep them for that. But I think even the smart kids, even the advanced kids, I think are so used to being like thrown like these big, heavy, these are the literary classics, and then when you give them Salem's Lot, which I'm sorry, at this point, Salem's Lot, I'll stand by this, and to my dying day, Salem's Lot is the modern Dracula. I really think it takes that place. It's a literary class, but they're reading Salem's Lot and being like, Mr. Lucia, I was reading it last night, and that scene with Danny Glick, and like a bird hit my window, and I freaked out. And I'm like, it's a pleasure to give that to even a 12 AP student, because I think they get so used to the grind of have to study this, have to do this, have to get a 4 or 5 on the AP test. So to be given something that reading it, and that they enjoy it, because I will say, and I can't remember who it was. I think it was there's a if you go on YouTube and you search up 1980 World Horror Panel, there's a panel that's got Stephen King, Peter Straub, Carl Edward Wagner, Chelsea Quinn Yarborough, Charles Grant, and I forget the other guy. And they're all talking about horror. And I think it was either Peter Straub or Carl Wagner that said, look, horror gives you everything. When horror is done well, it's an insightful commentary on humanity and how humanity encounters their own darkness, and how they try to rise above it, and how they encounter the world's darkness. And then the horror also gives you the suspense and the enjoyment. So and then it gives it. And I'll be honest, there are a lot of kids that when we get to the end of the horror unit, they're like, okay, no more horror. But then a lot of the kids are like, that was fun. And then my sophomores, we also end that unit by watching The Haunting, we watched The Woman in Black, which it's not necessarily that literary of a movie, but I love that movie. I love The Woman in Black. I just absolutely love the way it's done. And then my senior AP kids, we'll watch The Others with Nicole Kidman, and it's kind of I still feel like I'm teaching them something. I still feel like we're analyzing literature, but at least for that month of October, it's a little slice of like freedom from the academic, and they enjoy it. So.
Could you imagine have been sitting in on that panel in 1980?
I've watched that over and over and over again, and listening to all these people that I've never had the chance to meet, and unfortunately, some of them, Charles Grant's no longer with us and things like that. But I could have just imagined watching that. That would be great. Something else.
That's interesting. Now, online, you'll talk about like some of the things you go through with your family. How does family play into your faith, and how has that changed the way that you engage that?
Well, let's think about that. Obviously, my wife is also a Christian, and we've raised our kids that way. I will say this again, as a parent, you find really early on that there really is, and again, this is probably could be considered a sensitive, controversial area, things like that, especially if you are alive and watch the news, but I really have come to the realization that there is a really fine line between raising your kid in a faith, but then leaving room for their personal growth and indoctrinating them.
Right.
Okay, I at the end of the day, I want to be able to say, well, I communicated to my kids why this faith is important to us, and we about 3 years ago we made the decision that every night after dinner we do like a 10-minute family devotional with some light Bible reading, and then I have my daughter do a devotional, and my son is high functioning autistic, so while he is intelligent in his own way, he's not that independent, but every morning before his breakfast, we go over. We have a little Bible study guide that we got from my church, so I go over with him too. And so I think those things are important, but you have to be. There's a real fine line there between browbeating your kids into the faith and then showing it to them in your lives, you know, and how you,
right.
because I think there's I'll go out and say it, and again, I hope it's not controversial. I think there's a massive disconnect in Christianity today between the doctrine they say that they believe and the way that they carry it out, just in basic kindness. And like even my friend Chuck Breyer, who came down with me here at Scares of Cares, he's a fellow Christian writer like myself who also operates in the horror genre. He asked me this morning. We were talking about something else, I think people spamming on the HWA page, and my friend Chuck goes, how hard is it to not be a dick? Yeah. And I said, apparently really hard. and I'll say it without any apology, also within the Christian faith. Apparently it's really hard not to be a dick.
Right.
And there are a lot of people who will take certain tenets of the Bible, and I feel like it's just an excuse for you to be a dick, or to be misogynistic, or to be homophobic or racist, you know.
Right.
And I think as a parent, it's on the burden for you to show that to your kids in your lives, you know. So that's really, I wouldn't say that really changed, because before you get married, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. You know what I mean? Yeah. But as far as learning and really thinking, that's really, really important, you know. And I think also having Zach, again, not really changed, because I can't really say that. I guess you could say I'm kind of a blank slate. I guess it's a good thing or a bad thing. Right. But when you have a special needs child, that also really, again, shows you, again, saying it unapologetically, areas where the institution of the church, there are certain things they don't deal with well.
Right.
You know,
yeah,
and I remember being really shocked in college, where I was working as an aide at our local high school, and the other aide was also a Christian. And I don't know how he got on I know he got on the topic because I worked with autistic kids when I was in college. And this one girl who was very clearly born and bred evangelical Christian, gone to evangelical high school, kind of says in a whisper, do you think that autism is demon possession?
Oh, come on.
And I'm like, if we weren't surrounded by high school students, and if you weren't a girl, I might smack you. You know what I mean? And it was really, and I wouldn't say we've ever encountered that in the church, but that is one area the church has not done well in, is meeting the needs of parents with special needs. We're very fortunate the church that we attend now has done a great job with that. You know, it helps that one of the pastors is also a close friend of mine, has children who also have special needs, and I found that's what it takes. But they don't. My wife and I were talking about this the other day. Our churches will generally bring in people to have special messages on all areas of the gospel, special messages on how to engage in culture, special messages in missions, blah, blah, blah. You're not going to ever hear them bring in a special message on how do we meet the needs of special needs kids and families. You're just not. And that was, again, when we realized that as parents, you know, that with Zach's autism, that was kind of an eye-opener for us as well. And then one last thing, my wife and I have over the years gotten a really deep understanding of, you know, you can be in a church that prides itself on its doctrine and, you know, how biblical they are, and it could be a huge church that has all the bells and whistles, not exactly a Joel Osteen church, but, you know, it was, and they just don't carry it out. They don't carry it out. You know, we were in a church for a long time where, several years ago, my wife suffered a tibial plateau fracture, which is basically right below the knee. Everything got crushed into pebbles. So she has cement screws and a plate in there. And she was non-weight bearing for, I think, almost 6 or 8 months. And she, I had to dig out this. We had a sidewalk that was just like rocks, you know. But I'm just like, she's got to walk. She's got crutches in the winter. We need a legit sidewalk. So I had to dig out this huge trench just to get started with the sidewalk. And my wife at the church we were at, she emailed. And they're always saying, here's the thing. When I talked about that massive disconnect earlier, our church was great on talking about how we're in the body of Christ and we need to build each other up. So my wife emails and says, well, my husband needs to dig this thing out, and it's right before school's going to start. And they're like, we're wondering if there's any men in the church that might come over and help him. And the reply she got back was, well, I don't really know anybody who does that sort of thing. I'm like, it's a shovel and a pickaxe. Somebody. Now, on the flip side, the church we attend now, right before Scares That Cares, our submersible pump went. So like, we're without water for 2 or 3 days. And the church we're at now, I emailed my pastor, and then I called him like 5 minutes later, and he's like, I already sent an email out. You got 5 guys coming over to your house to help pull that pump. So we have 5 guys that came over and left their day jobs to come help me pull this pump and then put it back in again. And there's an example. And that was something for us, eye-opener for us as Christians and where we would want to be. That was a real eye-opener for me, that this is a church that's, at the very least, is living out what they're saying about being in the body of Christ. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. You almost have to get knocked down a little bit to remember that lesson, because for me, it was kidney failure and the transplant, and where a lot of people had to step up for me.
Yep.
And that made it much, much harder for me to get into judgment and some of the side things that we get angry. There's just not a lot of room for that anymore. And even attending church now, all the politics and stuff that goes behind it, I don't have a lot of energy to engage that or even really care about it very much. It's not why I go, and it's not why I get myself up in the morning. And even now, I can still see, as a person who believes in God, I still think that some of the things that are thrown at me, post-transplant are like booster lessons, to remind me of what I learned the first time, to keep going in that vein. And in a way, I'm kind of thankful for them. I'm thankful that that's there. And talking about with your kids and stuff, we raised our kids pretty conservative Christian, so they are a little sheltered, and we did that on purpose. But at the same time, we went to Christian school for a while, and we're homeschooling now. I kind of have to adjust my son's thinking a little bit, because he has had a very conservative line of thought, and from my standpoint, I'm pretty libertarian, political.
Right. Yeah.
So
I'm apolitical.
Yeah. So my wife and I don't drink, we don't smoke, we don't do any of that kind of stuff, and we teach our kids not to do that. But then we're constantly telling him, if you see other adults doing that, don't say anything. Right. It's not our business. We don't tell other people how to live their lives.
Exactly.
Don't be that guy.
Yeah. Don't be.
And then having to do the same thing with other social issues. It's like, okay, this is what we believe, but we don't tell these people to do that, and our only job is to love.
That's right.
People
At the end of the day, you
treat
treat people with that love that you say that Christianity is all about.
Right. And so, my goal is to have him not be that guy.
Yes,
what I'm saying? Yep. So, I'm constantly. That's my constant readjustment with my sons, is don't be that guy.
Right.
And kind of trying to explain that everyone around us thinks this way, and I think they're wrong, and this is why. And trying to push that forward. So it's interesting that you come from that standpoint. I knew you as a person of faith, because you don't hide it. Right. But I didn't know the specifics of kind of what you went into, and so that's kind of been interesting for me to kind of see that. Just as I'm gonna wrap up by telling a few things about you that I want people to know. But are you looking at a novel length at some point? Is that something that's still on you? Or
I actually just finished my first novel length. I had a novel that I've been working on for 4 or 5 years, and the lesson for why it took so long is you should outline. I am now a fan of outlining. In fact, I completed a 36-page outline this summer, so that's for the next novel. But I had a novel that had been languishing until Jim Moore basically just bullied me into finishing it, and I'm going through the first round of edits and things like that. So I'm hoping that can be something that at this stage of my career that I can send to an agent.
Good.
Because I think it's kind of crucial at this point to find an agent, but you really can't get an agent unless you've got a novel. So so that's what I'm kind of working on right now.
So it's about a sports star that.
No.
All right. Okay. Before we wrap up, we're talking to Kevin Lucia. Coming up in September 28th, you have a new short story collection coming out from Crystal Lake, which is a great publisher. They only put out good stuff. Things You Need is what it's called.
Things You Need.
September 28th is the release on that, and you won't regret picking it up. Also, in the nearest future, you have a novella with Cemetery Dance, also a publisher that only takes great stuff. Mystery Road. Okay, and so we can look forward to that coming out as well, and eventually some novel length that you're going to be pushing to. But everything you pick up from Kevin's going to be great. On Facebook, you can find him Kevin B. Lucia. That's Lucia, and then definitely go to kevinlucia.com, and you find your work various places on Amazon and other stuff. So just pick up something by him and read it. So again, thank you for being here, and thank you everybody for listening in. And I'll talk to you again next week.
Once upon a time, a madman, poet, and thief known as John Urbansick, that's me, challenged myself, to write a story a day, every day for a year, by hand. Some of them worked. Some of them failed. Some of them were spectacular. Then I did it again. Join me every week for Ink Stains as I do it a third time, and I will read you some of these stories. I'll talk about the process, about creativity in general, writing in specific, and maybe I can help ignite your